Ladies and gentlemen, it's a strange thing how love, that most beautiful and life-affirming of emotions, can so suddenly transform into something that feels like hatred. You see this in relationships all the time. Two people who once couldn't spend a day apart now can't stand to be in the same room. What's truly fascinating is that this transformation doesn't usually happen because the love was false or weak. Quite the opposite. It happens because the love was powerful. It was real enough to expose parts of ourselves that we didn't even know existed. When you love deeply, you open yourself to vulnerability. You let someone step into your psychological space, and whether you realize it or not, that act hands over a certain power, the power to affect you, the power to wound you. That's why when love collapses, when it fails, or when it feels betrayed, the emotional energy doesn't simply fade away. It inverts. It flips back on itself. The same energy that once pulled you toward the other person now pushes you away. It's not that love dies. It mutates into resentment, into pain, into a kind of emotional recoil. Psychologically, that reversal is tied to the fact that love and hatred are not opposites in the moral sense. They are both intense attachments. Indifference is the true opposite of love. Hatred still means you care, even if that caring has become corrupted by anger and disappointment. In Jungian terms, it's as if the same archetypal force that fuels love now manifests through its shadow. The attachment remains, but the expression becomes distorted. And that's what makes it so confusing, because the hatred feels real. It feels justified, yet underneath it, if you look closely enough, you can still find traces of affection, longing, and the unbearable memory of connection. The human psyche doesn't simply delete emotional bonds, it repurposes them. When something precious is lost, the mind often transforms the grief into hostility, because anger feels more bearable than helplessness. You can fight with someone you hate. You can't fight the emptiness of loss. That's why many people, when they claim to hate someone they once loved, are often still entangled. They're still fighting for meaning, trying to make sense of what went wrong. It's a psychological defense mechanism, a way of maintaining contact with what's been lost, even if that contact now takes the form of conflict. The hatred keeps the bond alive in a twisted, painful way. But if you step back, if you dare to see the deeper pattern, you realize something remarkable. The transformation of love into hatred reveals the power of the heart's energy. It shows how deeply we can feel, how profoundly we can be moved by another person. And if that energy can be reversed once, it can be transformed again, this time consciously. The same fire that burns in resentment can, through awareness and honesty, become the fire of wisdom, compassion, and maturity. So perhaps the goal isn't to avoid this emotional transformation, but to understand it, to see it as part of the human condition. Love can turn into hatred. Yes. But that hatred is a signal, a message from the Psyche saying, something within you remains unresolved. If you have the courage to listen, to face the truth without defensiveness or denial, you can turn the cycle into growth rather than destruction. Because in the end, love doesn't truly vanish. It hides behind the anger, waiting to be redeemed by understanding. The heart doesn't stop caring. It simply forgets how to express it. And the moment we recognize that, the war inside begins to quiet, and something higher within us starts to awaken. When we fall in love, we don't fall for a person as they are. We fall for what we see in them. And that's not quite the same thing. It's a projection, a reflection of our own inner ideal. We look at another human being and, often without realizing it, we assign them the qualities we most long for within ourselves: strength, beauty, kindness, passion, purpose. It's as if the psyche takes all the fragments of our unexpressed potential and paints them onto another person. That's why love feels transcendent in the beginning. It's the moment when we meet not just another soul, but the part of ourselves we've been yearning to find. But that illusion cannot last forever, because no human being can carry the weight of another's idealization. Eventually, cracks begin to appear. The person who once seemed flawless begins to disappoint us. They reveal sides of themselves that contradict the image we constructed. And what's worse, those flaws often mirror something within us, something we've denied or refused to face. Their impatience might expose our own fragility. Their selfishness might call attention to the hidden corners of our ego. Suddenly, what once felt divine becomes irritating, even unbearable. That's where the shadow enters the picture. In Jungian psychology, the shadow represents the parts of ourselves that we reject or suppress, the impulses, weaknesses, or truths we don't want to acknowledge. In relationships, those repressed elements often reappear through projection. We see them in the other person, and we react with disproportionate anger or disgust, as if they're the source of the problem. But the truth is, the emotional charge we feel doesn't belong entirely to them. It belongs to us. So when love turns to resentment, it's often not because the other person changed. It's because our perception changed. The illusion fell away, and now we're faced with the raw reality of human imperfection, both theirs and our own. And that realization can be deeply unsettling, because it forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that our love was never as selfless as we believed. It was conditional on them continuing to mirror the image we needed. When that image breaks, we feel betrayed, not by them, but by our own unmet expectations. If we're unaware of this process, we start to vilify the person we once adored. We rewrite the past, convincing ourselves that the love was false, that we were deceived. In reality, we're trying to protect our ego from the painful awareness of our own projection. It's easier to call someone toxic than to admit that we loved an illusion. But if we dare to look honestly, we can see that love wasn't the mistake. Our lack of consciousness was. That's why awareness is so crucial. If you can hold the tension between the ideal and the reality, if you can love someone not for who you imagine them to be, but for who they are, you move from fantasy into maturity. The idealization falls away, but something far greater takes its place: authentic connection. It's no longer about perfection, it's about understanding. And that's the turning point. Because love that survives disillusionment becomes real, it becomes grounded. When you stop demanding that another person embody your ideal, you finally begin to see them, and in seeing them, you begin to see yourself. That's where genuine love begins, not in projection, but in the courage to love without illusion. One of the most overlooked truths about love is how much fear is hidden within it. We like to think of love as purely generous, open, and selfless. But if you look closely, beneath that beauty lies a quiet anxiety. The moment we care deeply for someone, we give them the power to affect our emotional stability. That's the paradox of love. The more we love, the more we risk losing control. And the psyche doesn't like that. The ego, in particular, despises dependency because it threatens its illusion of self-sufficiency. So what happens when the balance tilts too far? When love feels overwhelming, or when our sense of independence starts to fade? The psyche instinctively reacts. It begins to build defenses, sometimes subtle, sometimes brutal. It replaces affection with coldness, openness with withdrawal, tenderness with irritation. We tell ourselves we've fallen out of love, but often that's not true. We've simply become afraid of the emotional exposure love demands. The ego interprets dependency as weakness, and so it fights back. It would rather destroy the connection than risk being wounded again. This is where the transformation of love into hostility often begins, not from betrayal or deception, but from fear. The fear of being vulnerable, of being dependent, of needing someone so deeply that their absence feels unbearable. That kind of need can awaken old wounds, the childhood experiences of neglect, rejection, or abandonment that we thought we had long outgrown. Suddenly, the relationship becomes a mirror, reflecting all the times we felt unseen or unloved, and that emotional memory fuels resistance. The heart wants to connect, but the ego wants to survive, and the two begin to battle inside us. What's tragic is that most people never realize this conflict is happening. They just feel an unexplained coldness growing where warmth once lived. They feel irritated by the very qualities that once drew them in. They might even start pushing the other person away, not because they've stopped loving them, but because the closeness feels dangerous. Intimacy becomes a kind of psychological trigger, a reminder of how easily love can turn to loss. And in that fear, they armor up. That's why so many relationships collapse under the weight of emotional self-protection. People would rather feel in control than risk being hurt. They withdraw into pride, resentment, or silence, convincing themselves they're safer alone. But the truth is, that safety is an illusion. You can't protect yourself from love without also cutting yourself off from life. To love is to accept that dependency is inevitable, not in a weak, clinging sense, but in a profoundly human one. You depend on others for meaning, for reflection, for growth. Every bond you form changes you, shapes you, deepens you. If you deny that, you might preserve your pride, but you'll also preserve your emptiness. The path forward is not to escape dependency, but to face it consciously. To admit that love will always make you vulnerable, and that vulnerability is not a flaw. It's the birthplace of connection. Strength is not found in detachment, it's found in the courage to love despite the risk. Because the moment you stop fearing the cost of love, you begin to experience its true power. And that's the irony of it all. The heart that dares to depend freely is the one that ultimately becomes unbreakable. The real war is never between two people. It's within one person. The battles that unfold in relationships are often external expressions of an internal division, a clash between what the heart desires and what the ego demands. On one side, there's the part of you that longs to love, to trust, to surrender. On the other, there's the part that fears exposure, that clings to control, that dreads rejection. When these two forces collide, you find yourself torn between the urge to connect and the instinct to protect. And that tension, the struggle between openness and self-preservation, is what turns love into conflict. You can see it when someone pushes away the very person they crave closeness with. They say things they don't mean, create distance they secretly despise, and then justify it with pride or logic. But if you look beneath the surface, you'll find fear at the root. Fear of being seen too clearly, of losing power, of reliving the pain of old wounds. The ego insists it's acting out of reason, that it's protecting itself from harm. But really, it's defending against vulnerability, because vulnerability feels like death to the ego. To love is to risk annihilation, to risk being changed by someone else. That's the hidden battle most people never acknowledge. It's not you versus them. It's you versus you. It's the side of you that wants to reach out fighting against the side that wants to retreat. The heart whispers, stay, while the ego shouts, run. And the louder that internal noise becomes, the more we start projecting it outward, blaming the other person for emotions that originate within ourselves. The relationship then becomes a stage on which our inner conflict performs itself. What we perceive as betrayal, disappointment, or rejection from another often mirrors our own inability to reconcile the opposing forces inside us. That's why arguments in love can feel so disproportionate. You might be fighting about something trivial, yet it feels existential. It's because you're not just arguing about the moment. You're wrestling with the parts of yourself that you haven't integrated. Until that integration happens, relationships become mirrors that reveal your own fragmentation. The people you attract, the conflicts you repeat, the pain you can't seem to escape, all of it reflects the unresolved war within. But there's another way to see it. What if these internal battles aren't punishments, but invitations? What if every emotional confrontation is a call to understand yourself more deeply? When you begin to see that your reactions are not purely responses to the other person, but signals from your own psyche, something transformative happens. You stop fighting to win and start listening to learn. You begin to notice which part of you is speaking, the fearful ego or the open heart. And that awareness changes everything. The moment you can hold both sides of the conflict consciously, the war starts to lose its grip. You realize that love isn't about erasing your fear, but about allowing love to exist alongside it. Real strength doesn't come from building walls. It comes from standing in that tension without collapsing into either pride or dependence. Because when you finally make peace with the divided parts of yourself, you stop making enemies out of the people you love. The war quiets not through victory, but through understanding. And in that silence, the heart finally remembers what it was fighting for all along. When pain goes unacknowledged, it doesn't disappear, it hides. It waits in the unconscious, collecting strength, waiting for the right moment to surface. And when it finally does, it often comes out sideways, disguised as irritation, criticism, or outright hatred. That's what projection really is. A psychological sleight of hand. It's when the mind says, "This isn't mine, it's yours." Instead of confronting our own discomfort, we assign it to someone else, usually the person closest to us. It's an ancient defense mechanism, built to protect the fragile ego from seeing the parts of itself it doesn't want to face. You can see this dynamic play out in the collapse of love. The person we once admired becomes the target of our frustration. Their habits, their tone, their choices, all suddenly feel intolerable. But beneath that irritation lies something deeper, a wound we haven't healed, an emotion we haven't processed, or an aspect of ourselves we've denied. When you're deeply connected to someone, they become a mirror for your inner world. Their flaws reflect your own hidden vulnerabilities. So when we lash out at them, what we're often reacting to is not who they are, but what they reveal about us. That's the tragedy of projection. It destroys understanding. It blinds us to truth. We stop seeing the person in front of us and instead see an image built from our unresolved pain. Every word they speak, every action they take, becomes filtered through that distorted lens. What might be a small misunderstanding becomes a symbolic betrayal. What might be a moment of imperfection becomes proof of malice. The relationship shifts from connection to warfare, and neither side can tell what's real anymore. This is why relationships can feel like they spiral into chaos so quickly. Two people, both carrying their own unhealed wounds, begin projecting onto each other. And suddenly, they're fighting battles that have nothing to do with the present moment. Each sees the other as the enemy, when in truth, both are fighting their own reflection. The arguments become circular, the emotional distance grows, and the love that once united them becomes buried under layers of unconscious accusation. The way out of this cycle is not through control or blame. It's through awareness. You have to become curious about your own reactions. When you feel anger, when resentment rises, ask yourself, what part of me feels threatened right now? What truth am I refusing to see? That question alone can change everything, because awareness breaks the spell of projection. Once you can see that your perception is being colored by your own inner landscape, you regain a measure of freedom. You stop demanding that the other person carry the burden of your shadow, and you begin the difficult work of carrying it yourself. That's where maturity begins, when you stop expecting others to heal what you refuse to confront. Love cannot survive in the fog of projection, but it can grow in the light of self-understanding. When two people take responsibility for their inner worlds, something extraordinary happens, the projection fades, and real intimacy takes its place. You no longer need the other person to be perfect. You just need them to be real. And that's the quiet revelation at the heart of it all. The moment you stop projecting your pain onto others, love becomes possible again. Because now you're finally seeing, not an illusion, not a reflection, but another human being standing before you in truth. Healing doesn't begin with forgetting, nor does it come from forcing reconciliation. It begins with understanding, deep, uncomfortable, honest understanding. When love turns into hatred, when affection curdles into bitterness, most people spend their lives trying to change the other person, to get answers, to make the past make sense. But the truth is, the real work isn't out there, it's in here. The transformation doesn't happen by revisiting the story of what they did or didn't do. It happens when you turn inward and ask a far more unsettling question. What part of me collapsed when love turned to pain? That question pulls you out of blame and into consciousness. Because hatred, as intense as it feels, is often a disguise for something more vulnerable: grief, disappointment, or loss of meaning. It's the psyche's way of protecting you from confronting that unbearable softness. Hatred feels strong. It feels certain. It gives you the illusion of control. But it also chains you to the past. The person who hurt you may be gone, but as long as the emotion dominates your inner world, you remain psychologically bound to them. To heal, you must be willing to let go of the illusion that hatred keeps you safe. This doesn't mean excusing betrayal or pretending the pain wasn't real. It means seeing the full picture, understanding that the person who hurt you was also human, also struggling, also fighting their own shadow war. When you begin to see the patterns, rather than just the personalities, something inside you begins to loosen. The bitterness loses its grip because you're no longer feeding it with the energy of denial. You're learning to see what is, not just what you wish it had been. Conscious awareness transforms the emotional landscape. It allows you to integrate what was split apart, to reclaim the parts of yourself that were buried beneath anger and sorrow. That's what reconciliation really is, not necessarily with the other person, but within yourself. It's the moment when love and hate no longer have to be enemies, but can coexist as teachers. Love shows you the heights of your potential. Hatred reveals the depths of your wounds. Both are pathways to self-knowledge if you have the courage to walk them consciously. And in that awareness, compassion naturally emerges, not as a moral virtue, but as a psychological necessity. You begin to see that everyone, including yourself, acts from some mixture of ignorance, fear, and pain. That realization doesn't justify what's been done, but it helps you break free from the endless loop of resentment. You stop needing the world to apologize before you can heal. You stop needing revenge to feel whole. The peace you were waiting for from others begins to arise from within you. Because ultimately, no heart truly hates without having once loved deeply. Hatred is love that's been wounded, turned inward, and left unresolved. And that means the power to transform it lies in the same place it began, in you. When you choose awareness over bitterness, you reclaim the energy that was trapped in the war. You turn pain into wisdom, loss into understanding, and the story of betrayal into a story of rebirth. And maybe that's the final act of love, not toward them, but toward yourself. To rise above the shadow war of the heart, and remember that your capacity to feel deeply, even in pain, is proof that something sacred within you still lives.